Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2018 Harmony webinar series. My name is Gina Thorne, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Harmony Foundation. It's my pleasure today to be joined with Andrew Sidoli, who's the Executive Clinical Director of Recovery Ways, who's going to be presenting on trauma in the family, attachment as the basis for treatment. For those of you that are new to Harmony Foundation, Harmony is located in Estes Park, Colorado. We're 2 miles below Rocky Mountain National Park. We sit on 43 acres. We are a residential rehab facility that provides comprehensive treatment for adults and their family members. So who is Harmony? Harmony believes that long-term recovery from alcohol and other drugs is possible. We do this because we believe that we are a place between two worlds where our location in the Rockies can provide a safe and quiet respite from the pain of addiction. We have now 49 years of treating addiction. We've fostered a generation of long-term recovery who supports our clients and families for a lifetime. Our staff at all levels of the organization works together to create a community of recovery support that is long-lasting. We are a 70-bed residential program. We offer a full continuum of care, beginning at detox through transitional living. As I mentioned earlier, we're located at the base of Rocky Mountain National Park in Estes Park, Colorado. We offer an evidence-based 12-step program that is gender responsive. If anyone is interested in learning more about Harmony, we invite you to visit us at harmonyfoundationinc.com. Or if you know someone that needs treatment right away, we invite you to call our admissions staff at 866-686-7867. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. The workshop today is NADAC approved for 1 credit hour. We ask that you please be sure to complete the online evaluation at the end of the webinar. It should populate to you within an hour after the webinar is over. You will receive a certificate of completion by email by Friday. If you don't see the survey and you don't see the email, we ask that you reach out to Christy Weeks at cweeks@harmonyfoundationinc.com. I'd like to provide a special thank you to Recovery Ways and for Andrew's time in presenting on this important topic. We appreciate our partnership with our organizations that work with us on our webinar series, and I think you'll be very happy to learn more, not just about trauma, but about the work that Recovery Ways does. Harmony is a big supporter of Recovery Ways. We do refer our clients to them. And if you're interested in learning more about Recovery Ways, we invite you to visit them at recoveryways.com. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Andrew. Andrew has an extensive 20-year background in a multitude of chemical dependency and mental health settings that shaped his firm belief in human strength and resiliency and his passion for working with this population. He's committed to helping individuals and families achieve change and reach their potential. His education includes a bachelor's degree from the University of New Mexico in Child Development and Family Studies and a master's degree in social work from New Mexico Highlands University. As a certified addiction counselor and clinical social worker steeped in psychodynamic and attachment training, he complements his therapeutic skills as an EMDR practitioner. He brings a holistic approach to his work with individuals at Recovery Ways and is passionate about body and mind integration. His client-centered approach and a wide diversity of skills complements our clinical mission and makes him an asset to the organization. Prior to joining Recovery Ways, Andrew was actively engaged for years in several recovery initiatives in New Mexico and served a variety of agencies committed to bringing a change in their communities. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Gina. What a wonderful introduction, and thank you for hosting this. And I had the pleasure of visiting Estes Park and see your campus and meet some of your staff, and it was a wonderful experience. So I'm excited to be working with you again. So can everybody hear me? I am assuming that everybody can. So I wanted to give a little bit of scaffolding for the idea of using attachment and thinking about family of origin as attachment trauma and how to use it in the course of treatment. There are 2 things I want to sort of preface. One, that I think that the way that we use current assessments I'm thinking in particular about the biopsychosocial, which generally sort of is the first document how we sort of launch into treatment, is a really poor document. I think it does, checks a lot of boxes, and obviously we use it for insurance purposes, but we no longer take the time to do a really comprehensive family history, specifically looking at attachment issues in early childhood. And I find that the attachment issues that come with our patient population are often a barrier to treatment, and then go under identified and under resolved. And of course, when we look at attachment, all studies show that basically the cathartic element in the therapeutic relationship is the ability of the therapist to connect with their patients. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether one is a CBT therapist or as DBT or what kind of modality we bring to it. But the ability to connect and attach is very, very important. And in fact, it's probably one of the biggest predictor in a successful outcome in a good therapeutic relationship. So having said all that, I'm going to start moving forward to, let's take a look at some of the early childhood issues and how attachment plays a part in personality. So obviously, everything that we know about ourselves and about others, and then about sort of how we construct meaning in life, is formed by our relationships with our caregivers. Probably one of the most important functions that caregivers have in early childhood, and I may use sort of he or she intermittently, but it can be either caregiver, and we now know that fathers play just as an important part as mothers if they're the primary caregiver, is that the infant's central nervous system is actually mediated by the central nervous system of the caregiver. Not just that, but it enables the infant, the developing infant, to basically start to access emotional process, and is both mediating in negative states and is also eliciting positive states. So that's what we would call the sort of dyad of attachment. So we know that, I don't know if any of you remember some of the Romanian adoptions in the late 80s, where children were basically placed in institutions and were neglected. So there was a number of studies done in Europe that showed that the attachment rupture and attachment trauma actually led all the way to autism. There's some very interesting studies that were done back then. And in fact, we could say that the caregiver's primary role is to repair attachment functions. So when you think about how brain development is shaped, and then how the stress-induced situational events can actually bring about neuronal cell death, I think it can be sort of clearer than that, just how what an impact this can have on sort of functional impairments in the emotive and the cognitive processes in the brain. And so, in going back to some of the ways that we think about childhood, and when we're talking to our patients, I think we have a tendency, because sometimes we're in a sort of context of where sort of time is of the essence, and we tend to resort to trying to help patients deal with what's top of mind and what is, whatever crisis they're bringing to us. As I said, we have little time to really look at what happened in early childhood. So if we think about some of the things that can affect attachment, we can kind of look at what was going on for the family in your patient's first 2 years of life. For example, were there financial stresses? Did the mother suffer from postpartum depression? Was there a significant relocation whereby external or where family bonds were disrupted, or the grandparents, uncles, aunts, the extended family, so that isolating the parents and the infant. Was there any kind of trauma? Was there alcohol use or mental health situations? So any of those things that would have put a high amount of stress on the caregiver's ability to be focused on the attachment bond with the infant is actually going to persist in some of the issues that our patients bring to us. And I think that one of the as a trauma therapist, one of the things that I see is that very often we're dealing with explicit trauma. But because of the age of these events, we generally our patients don't have a recollection, they have no memory, they have no way of being able to articulate the experience of early childhood. So, we generally can sort of intimate or kind of point to the difficulty in relationships that our patients have, and we can take a long history about some of those relational issues or relationship with self as far as self-esteem. But as we sort of go through the slides, we can see that when we go into the adult attachment interview, it's a very, very focused way of helping patients to identify some of the attachment trauma and some of the relational lessons that they've internalized from their caregiving. So I think that this present slide and the idea of sort of coping with stressful stimuli and regulating emotion is something that we generally tend to see with a vast majority of our patients. I think everybody has an experience of fight or flight and what that means in the care of a patient. We're generally thinking about more sort of explicit traumatic responses. But when we start kind of linking the past to the present and some of the patient's current relational issues, then we can see how this is a pervasive and ongoing issue. Here's a child well sort of describes that state of infant distress. A slide to kind of help to put this in context. I think one of the the freeze reactions is oftentimes the more difficult one to treat because it's pervasive, it's underlying, it tends to result in some very sort of passive resistance to therapy. And it sort of oftentimes shows up in dissociation and and not in a clinical sense, but more in the ability of the patients to basically integrate their somatic experience, their emotions, their feelings, and be present for their experience. To sort of point to the experience of some of the institutionalized children in Romania, which these studies were done, that showed really remarkable levels of dissociation and all going all the way to autistic states. So most of you are probably familiar with Ainsworth. I generally, it's rare that we see individuals with a secure attachment style in a treatment setting. Often, but if we do, they have an ability to move through therapy at quite a different rate than the vast majority of patients. So their ability to connect to the therapist and to trust their own innate resiliency, these patients really stand out. Doesn't mean that they cannot end up in a treatment facility with a substance use issue, but generally it's a much easier patient to work with, and generally the use has not been so prolonged and so chronic. To some extent, thinking about treating addiction as an attachment or relational disorder kind of helps us to conceptualize the experience of patients, and thinking about dealing with working on three different domains: the intrapersonal, so the patient's relationship with themselves, their sort of their thoughts about themselves, their personal narrative about themselves; the interpersonal, which is always, well, certainly it's very much part of the therapeutic relationship, and but then in this is where we see most of the milieu issues when we're working with patients. We're working in the interpersonal domain, and then I would say that the existential domain, when we're getting to more of an existential issue, when we're looking at purpose and meaning and sometimes despair, then we're thinking about more of an existential relationship. And as I said, I feel that we learn everything that we know about ourselves and the world is learned through our family of origin and the values that we've internalized. So as we look at the adult attachment interview, and we use it primarily to start linking the past and the relational strategies that our patients have as a way of bringing it into the present and creating a template for, or a foundation for, insight, and use it as an ongoing document, and we use it as a constant frame of reference for basically everything that is relational that happens with the therapist, with the milieu, with the staff, and oftentimes with their family members or their children. So As you can see from the questions, it starts looking at the context of the individual's family of origin and starts to paint a picture. Now, number three is I think is one of the most interesting parts of this work, in the sense that you know we have qualitative words to describe the relationship with both our mothers and fathers, and there's generally a fair amount of resistance. Most of the patients I work with tend to find some resistance or a sense of disloyalty. Not all, but a lot of individuals tend to have this innate loyalty to the family system. There are a number of plausible explanations why mom was, distracted, or dad was absent, or et cetera, et cetera. So, but this is generally something that we spend a little bit of time on. 5 adjectives is a minimum, but we really start to look at what was the general emotional terrain that the patient has experienced with the mother and with the father. We now start to take a look at where the patient has a higher level of identification and who they're feeling closest to. So this speaks to a style of attachment and emotional and attachment repair. What kind of caregiving and emotional attunement would happen in the family. Remember, we're starting to put this information as a schema to then start thinking about what our patient has internalized. So as you can imagine, in a family where when somebody's emotionally wounded, or or perhaps sort of physically hurt, then and where the sort of the message is, suck it up, or don't be such a crybaby. You can imagine the level of self-compassion that a patient has internalized towards their own experience. Separation from parents. And it's really interesting because, especially if you have the ability to work with the family members as well, getting this kind of information from the family perspectives is really, really interesting. There is often a really sort of a wide disconnect. I never cease to be amazed at how, for example, the parents of a young adult remember a certain situation, and then what the disconnect between what the young adult and the patient is actually remembers about that situation. And getting really good descriptions of those events is really interesting to compare and contrast. One of the things that oftentimes we might have, we probably should have gotten this in the biopsychosocial, but I certainly noticed that we do have a prevalence of adoptees in our mental health and substance use population, and so I found that this questionnaire works really well with adoptees as well, and it kind of made me think about the age of disclosure about adoption is really interesting, because there's a whole narrative that's written about, or that's sort of internalized about rejection, and usually it's at the age of disclosure. And I would say that it's the adjectives that the patient is using about the adopted parents are still going to hold true, but the adoption adds a level of complexity insofar as the internal narrative that the patient has about being rejected and not being wanted. So there is a more work to be done, or certainly it adds a level of complexity. There is often a very clear narrative from the patient about an event where they've often internalized the sort of family narrative about that time that, I don't know, patient was left alone at home with a younger sibling and didn't know where the parents were, or so on and so forth. So it's really interesting to get your patient's experience about plausibility narratives when we're dealing with potentially issues of abuse or neglect or abandonment, because these are the same narratives that are going to reappear in their relationships with their current spouses, with their current families, and they're going to sort of pop up in their narratives with their experience of other staff members or others in the milieu, or potentially you in their transference. I like the fact that it's asking about whether an individual has been jokingly threatened, or they have memories of potentially some abusive memory, because we generally find that our patients, when asked, they have these narratives, these excuses that are often part of the family narrative about being called slow or stupid, and so on and so forth. And yet we all know that potentially one of the deepest levels of trauma is bullying, and that it's a very pervasive, and that sort of shaming and bullying practices, whether certainly if done in the home, they're even more pertinent, but even when done in the sort of schoolyard, are really difficult and pervasive issues to help our patients deal with. Generally, if the patient has a child, a shaming or bullying experience tends to create a sort of an overprotective approach to children. We generally want to protect our family members, our children, from experiences that we've had, but it's certainly going to inform a parenting style. And so as you can see, this is starting to build an architecture, a way of thinking about how the past has informed the present. The idea of finding out who else in the individual's life was a role model, or potentially was able to mediate some lack of parenting, I think is particularly important, because we all have memories from childhood of adults or teachers or people in our neighborhood, or that made an impression, where we felt seen or we felt appreciated, and usually sort of coincides with perhaps a moment of feeling coupled with a feeling of neglect during our sort of childhood circumstances. The issue of loss and grief with the loss of a parent or another loved one. I think it's really important. Of course, there are really interesting cultural variations on how individuals and family groups deal with the loss and how they make meaning of it, and some of the rituals that go around death and how families come together. But certainly in a system that's challenged by the stress of a loss, or in some sort of cultures, there isn't very much of time for children, and the idea of death and grief and loss are not really fully explored for especially for young children. I think oftentimes we have, especially when there's alcohol and mental health with parents, our patients report really, really close feelings with grandparents. And then at the loss of a grandparent, it seems to be a real turning point on how that individual's development and their social relations, and it seems that it really takes a turn for the worse. The idea of attending a funeral and sort of rituals around death and loss and grief, I think, are really important to help people arrive at some kind of meaning and having closure. And I think we don't do this very well in our society. So now we're starting to look at the contrast between the early childhood and the current relationships that our patients have with an adult. Now, I would sort of generalize and say that we generally have either stayed very close to the internalized family value and system that we've had with our parents, and therefore we're going to be somewhat more resistant to approaching this kind of work, or we're on the other end of the spectrum where we've been clear that things did not go right, or we're clear about some injustices or some abuse or neglect in our family, and the pendulum has swung completely the other way, and we've rejected the vast majority of values or the things that we've learned within our family. And so you would find that, that this would be this question, number 16, would be answered by a very high conflict current relationship, or potentially emotional cutoff with the family members. This is typically what we would be referring to sort of inner child work, and it starts to taking to look at your patient's ideal expectations about parenting. If the individual you're working with has a child of their own, then this opens up a whole avenue of sort of idealized parenting expectations of oneself, and then potentially how their substance use or mental health symptoms have affected them. And so this is going to open up a whole avenue of work. But hopefully some of the preceding sort of family of origin stuff that's emerged gives a little bit more context and can help us to move the patient away from a place of shame and more into a current status and hopeful wishing moving forward. the idea of what else you've learned from childhood experiencing, is also looking at you know helping patients to identify strengths and resilience in whatever they've described up to now, because that's an important part of the work that we do with our patients, and it's certainly worth having them really think about some of the more helpful things that they've acquired in their family of origin. And then finally, the question, again, looking at sort of the idealized parenting style that an individual will be bringing to their children. What are you aiming for? What are you wishing for? So this is pretty much the process that you sort of go through in working with the adult attachment review. Originally, it was designed to measure the attachment style, but the way that I've been using it for years is to really try to link the past, to try to identify relational or attachment trauma, and to bring it into the present, so that as I am dealing with the more explicit trauma, and we start to kind of clear some of that work, we're then able to go into the relational issues that our patients are really coming to us with. So one of the things that I tend to really focus on is to going back into the original questions about the quality of the caregivers. So we're asking our patients to identify the positive and caring qualities of the mother and the father, and then I ask for the less positive or some of the negative attributes. Once we have that kind of list of attributes, some of the work involves asking the patient to basically identify with some of these. So I generally ask the patient, how are you like your mother? How are you like your father? Both in the positive and in the negative. Because I feel that one of the things that we can really help our patients to gain insight is, how do we internalize our family of origin kind of values? What do we internalize from our parents? And how does that show up in our own internal narrative, in our self-talk, right? Because if we're thinking about relational issues, then we generally find that, and I would encourage anybody who is sort of here listening to this to actually go through this and go through the exercise. It's a fascinating exercise to do. I've done it a few different times in my own life and my development, and I always find sort of a rich and stimulating experience. But the idea is that as I look at what I've internalized from the caregiving qualities that my father and my mother had, I've been able to identify more and more how I've basically I've internalized that self-talk, and how I am like my mother and like my father, which of course is one of the tragedies in life. And that isn't to say that all those qualities are not that they're all bad, but the idea is that we cannot really individuate, really become our own adults, unless we're really able to analyze and be very clear about what we've internalized. So I think it's a lot to ask a patient in a short-term care unit. I found that I've worked both in private practice and in longer-term facilities, where this document has become a template and a frame of reference for, as I said, all relational issues, both the transference with the therapist, where once we're clear about, what some of those qualities are, because they're going to come up in the patient's experience with you. I don't know if any of you use the subjective rating scale, Dr. Scott Miller's work. it's a really nice tool to use from an attachment perspective, because it helps the patient kind of really identify how they value the therapeutic encounter. So, and it makes them consumers into this relationship, and it helps the therapist to really stay focused on the quality of the relationship. So, but certainly this, in my mind, is foundational work that would accompany somebody who is embarking on the process of self-discovery and therapy for their whole life. And very much the idea that you are going to be using it as a template or as a frame of reference for how you talk to yourself, how you engage with others, and then how your family of origin has shaped your views on life. So this is how we tend to take a sort of look at addiction. And the idea, it's a little bit like sort of Maslow's pyramid, but we're looking at the intrapersonal realm, so the self, the interpersonal, how we relate to others, and then the idea of the existential idea of purpose and meaning in life, and therefore the idea that addiction is just a symptom of a relational disease. And so I put sort of family of origin and attachment and the work that we just sort of covered as it's meant to be an arrow that goes up and down, because it's always going to be pertinent in all these domains. And then, of course, trauma, grief, and loss, because both the family of origin, the attachment, the trauma, the grief, and loss are issues that permeate all three relational domains. So I hope this has been interesting and stimulating. Happy to entertain questions, and I'm going to hand it over to Gina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. There was a question that came up asking about access to the slides. How would you like to have people access those slides if they would like them?
Yes, absolutely. I think if we could get, I don't know, are you able to collect everybody's email, and then I can send the, either do this for Ryan or do it for me. There's a lot of material, especially on the neurobiology, so I didn't want to spend a lot of time going into that, but yeah, it's a lot to go over in 45 minutes.
Right. And so what we can do for folks who are interested is, if you want to reach out to me directly, I will be sure to connect you with Andrew, and you can access the slides through him. I'm going to ask folks if they have any additional questions to please feel free to type it into the question box, and we'll be happy to answer those questions. We will have the recorded version of this slide presentation available as well if people would like to access that. And then we also will be providing the PowerPoint as well. So I don't see any additional questions that are coming in at this time, so I feel like we're at a good stopping point. If anybody has any additional questions, Andrew, do you have an email that you can provide to folks that they might be able to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's asidoli@recoveryways.com.
Perfect. I do have somebody, Diane Sanders, just asked, as discussed, influence around early childhood trauma for the client is a core issue for addiction and mental health disorders. How do you see treatment models evolving towards a systematic focus, which includes treating family members on their childhood trauma?
Yeah, that's a great question. Hi, Diane. I think we have to treat the whole family. So I don't think it's possible to do good family work by just providing psychoeducation to the family, because then when that happens, we maintain the focus on the sort of symptoms of the overarching problem, and we keep the focus on the identified patient. So one of the ways that we do this is to actually involve the parent, the whole family unit, and have the parents actually do their own genogram, because it does give it balances the relational dynamic in the family. After all, none of us came into sort of parenting with the manual. Of course, we always assume that parents do the very best that they can with what they're given, and there is context to that particular family, to the first couple of years in that family's life, and a lot of that is predicated by what the parents had received parenting. So it's certainly a generational issue. We certainly know how epigenetics have informed this. Lots of studies about this. So I feel that unless we're able to get the whole family and look at the previous generation's parenting and how that's informed the parents of your current patient, then we can't do a really comprehensive work, because again, I feel that the addiction is really the tip of the iceberg.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple more questions that popped in. Are the self-assessments mentioned, will those be available as well? I didn't see them in the slide deck, but do you have a way for folks to be able to access those self-assessments that you mentioned?
Well, this is it starts out with the your childhood. So if you were to go online, the adult attachment questionnaire is actually available. It's open software. But what I did was I wanted to take away the scoring element, because we're not assessing or scoring. We know that the vast majority of our patients actually come with either with an avoidant attachment, or with a mixed attachment, or insecure attachment. So basically, the issue is that I've kind of modified it so that we're just looking, and renamed it your childhood, but this is basically the document that we're using, and the questions have remained exactly the same. So if you look at the slides, once it starts with your childhood, I think it's slide 18 or 19, I forget, you can sort of go through this process on your own, and you'll be quite amazed at what that kind of brings up.
Okay. Last question we have is, I noticed ambivalent and anxious attachment styles in your slides, but I missed the disorganized attachment style. Did I just miss that? If not, can you speak to how this shows up related to trauma and addiction treatment, as well as other mental health issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly it's always on a continuum, and so I find that generally when we have patients in an acute level of care, when we're dealing with sort of medications and we're doing therapy, or we're doing other sort of activities, patients can move in and out of the attachment styles. We sort of know, we used to think that an attachment style was a sort of pretty fixed personality trait, and we know that they're not, and people can certainly move in and out of different attachment styles. Certainly, an underlying attachment trauma is going to exacerbate sort of fight or flight. And so depending on how the individual is being stimulated or is being activated in their sort of trauma responses, then you're going to see a slightly different attachment style. But I do think that those change through somebody's recovery process and insight process. So I think it's difficult to, and hopefully you would see it change through the course of the patient's relationship with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I think that we have hit all of the questions that came in. I want to thank all of you who participated in today's webinar. I also would like to again thank Recovery Ways for their partnership in being a part of this webinar. If you have yet to get your certificate by Friday, please be sure to reach out to us. And we will be hosting our next webinar on September the 26th, August the 26th, Daniel Ledenberger Klein with Rivermend Health will be working on a topic related to family systems. And so thank you again, Andrew, for your time and for your expertise. And we look forward to working with you future in Recovery Ways, as well as those that are interested in learning more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gina. Thank you for organizing it. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.